I won't bore your listeners with the full story, but on my first day, I was filling out my insurance forms, and the head of our criminal division came in my office. Her name was Nicole. And she said, "Hey, I need you to run up to courtroom 301. We've got a DUI trial. I need you to pick a jury." And I froze. I was like, what? I just got here an hour ago.
How can the GC be a true partner to the executive team? How about in the public company context? How does the GC ensure that that same can-do attitude that they bring to the table pervades the rest of their legal team? Today, we are joined on the abstract by my friend Matt Campobasso, General Counsel of Enfusion. Enfusion provides a software platform that unifies the front, middle, and back offices for investment managers. And I'll ask Matt at some point to give us a sort of more detailed explanation about what Enfusion does too. Matt was promoted 2 years ago to the GC role after serving as their Deputy General Counsel, a transition that we're going to chat about today. He also has prior experience as GC of Truqua, an IBM company, and as a litigator, and he started his career as a state prosecutor. Matt, thanks so much for joining me today for this episode of The Abstract.
My pleasure, Tyler. I really appreciate you having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast.
Well, that's nice of you to say. We've had a lot of great GCs on. I'm super excited for our conversation. I actually want to go back and start a bit. I'm watching this show right now, Presumed Innocent, yes, on Apple TV. You started as a state prosecutor in Illinois, right?
Yes. Not in Cook County, but in Illinois, like Jake Gyllenhaal's character on the show. Yes. It's a great show.
I guess, first question, is the show accurate? Does it depict the life of a prosecutor and what the offices look like sort of for real, or is it Hollywoodized?
You know what? Present company included. I didn't have any colleagues that were as handsome as Jake Gyllenhaal. So, that part was definitely Hollywoodized. It was funny. I watched it, and it's been a long time since I was a prosecutor. I left the prosecutor's office back in 2008. That being said, there were some things that really kind of rang true for me. I think, the pace with which things can move definitely was there. Obviously, the circumstances around the show are a bit different. Neither myself or any of my colleagues were ever accused of murdering any of our colleagues. Sure. So that's, obviously a good thing. But no, there were definitely some things that I was like, oh man, like that feels a little bit like I can remember that. Like I can remember sitting in an office late at night, like, and working with my trial partner, talking about like strategy or a closing argument and thinking about things. Obviously, like most legal dramas or even like, criminal procedure dramas, everything's kind of condensed. But yeah, there were definitely, and, I don't know how far you are into the show. We'll avoid spoilers for your listeners, but
thank you.
Of course, and for you, obviously. But the Peter Skarsgård character, the prosecutor, Tommy Molto, I think is his name on the show.
Yep.
I really enjoyed his performance, not only because he's a great actor, but because it was very similar to openings, closings, examinations. Sometimes you'd find yourself getting very kind of swept up in the facts of a case. And, obviously in that show, it's very personal. For me personally, like I can recall specifically some cases where there were some pretty horrendous crimes committed, and just sometimes having to like really be mindful of separating like my own emotion and my own sense of like right and wrong from my job. And that's something that actually, if depending on how far you are into the show, like they definitely seem to touch on that idea a little bit, which is, hey, you can't make things personal. And again, it's very different under the circumstances of the case in Presumed Innocent. But I consider myself a relatively empathetic person. And so I would oftentimes be in cases and, if we were unable to obtain like a guilty verdict and a victim had come in and testified, you take that home with you. And so obviously, again, the stakes and the underlying circumstances are very different than my experience. But I can see some of the emotional parallels that I had as a prosecutor. And it's just highly entertaining, like very, very entertaining television.
That's really interesting that you bring up sort of taking it home. I think there's a part of that, though, that is what motivates people to want to work in government or to want to work as a prosecutor or, as a public defender, or is that you feel that attachment to the outcome.
Yes.
It's not just sort of like numbers on a spreadsheet trending in the right direction or the graph headed in the right way.
Yep.
Did you go into the law with the idea of becoming a prosecutor in mind? Like what inspired you to pursue the law as your career?
Yeah, it's funny. I have a daughter. She's 10. We were just driving home last night. She takes guitar lessons, and over time, as taking her there each week, I have always wanted to learn how to play a string instrument. And I was given a banjo as a gift. I'm a big fan of the Avett Brothers. It's a band. I don't know if you know them or not, but I'm a huge fan. Banjo features heavily. My dad got me a banjo for Christmas years ago, and I will pluck it. I'm not very good. And so I've gone into these lessons with her for 2 years. And about 5 months ago, the owner was like, hey, you should schedule banjo lessons at the same time that your daughter's taking guitar. So last night we were at banjo/guitar lessons. And on the way home, she started 5th grade today. So we were talking about education and school, and it's not a super long car ride, but I was like, what do you think, do you have a sense of what you want to be when you grow up? And she was like, I want to be a lawyer. And I said, are you sure? Really? I'm a lawyer, right? You've seen what it did to me. And she's like, yeah. And it's funny, of my 3 kids, people often say that she is like from a personality perspective and intellectually, the apple that fell closest to the tree. And I actually said to her, I could 100% see you. She has that analytical mind, that desire to help people, the desire to solve problems. And so I had that at a young age also. It's not uncommon that I am told that I overthink things, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing as a lawyer. In my personal life, it can create a lot of friction, as you might imagine. But for me, it was always an idea that I liked. I saw legal movies growing up, and I thought, well, that's cool. And again, it's Hollywoodized. But my uncle, who is also my godfather, is a lawyer. He is a retired lawyer, but someone I looked up to when I was younger. And I remember thinking when I got older about a career, and I just said to him, do you like being a lawyer? And he's like, I love it. You get to help people, you get to solve problems. And I remember he said, you should really look into it. And I did. And I was pre-law as an undergrad, and I enjoyed it. I took some legal learning classes in high school. We had some local lawyers that came in and taught us a zero period, before school started. I was kind of a nerd. So I was like, let me take extra classes. And so
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was cool. It was a very cool experience. And we did mock trials and stuff. And yeah, I was fascinated by the idea that really, regardless of what part of the world you're thinking about, right? Region indifferent, industry indifference, whether it's education or health or, criminal justice, lawyers are there, right? And they're not just there, they're there in a way that influences outcomes. And they have, a lot of our elected officials are lawyers or have law degrees, and it's an incredibly versatile education. I always think I would want to be more of a traditional practicing lawyer, which is what I've been since I was licensed in 2006. So that's what kind of got me to the law. When I was in law school, my first year, I was a good student. I wasn't top of my class by any means. And so when on-campus interviews were happening, I threw my hat in the ring with a couple firms, didn't get any bites. And I was like, okay, time to think about, my contingency. And in talking with my uncle, the same uncle, he said, some of the best lawyers I've ever worked with in my career came through the state's attorney's office. They were prosecutors. And so I thought, okay, and he's like, look, you could do it for a couple of years. You cut your teeth. They throw you in the deep end, and you're going to learn a lot of lessons. You're going to fall on your face, but you'll come out of it so advanced for that point in your career. And so I did it. And I was there for almost 2 years. I clerked as a law student in Lake County, Illinois, which is just northwest of Chicago. And then I actually prosecuted as a licensed attorney from 2006 to 2008 in McHenry County, which is due west of Chicago. So all of which is about 45 miles from the city. The reason I went to the collar counties was because in Cook County, where we see presumed innocent taking place, there's a
Yeah.
hierarchy of time served. And so you go through like appeals and then family court. And it's kind of like before you're trying cases like in presumed innocent, you've been there for
I
10
see.
years. And I knew this was probably a 2 or 3 year thing for me. And so I thought, where can I go? I'd rather be a bigger fish in a smaller pond, because for me, it's all about extracting the experience. And so I went to McHenry County, and I won't bore your listeners with the full story, but on my first day, I was filling out my insurance forms, and the head of our criminal division came in my office. Her name was Nicole. And she said, "Hey, I need you to run up to courtroom 301. We've got a DUI trial. I need you to pick a jury." And I froze. I was like, "What? I just got here an hour ago." And she's like, "Yeah, so-and-so is out." I didn't know who so-and-so was. And I was like, "Okay." And so I went up there, and I walked in, and there was another lawyer there. His name is Bill Stanton. He was like a longtime prosecutor. And I was like, "Oh, thank God." And he's like, "What?" And I said, "I think we're trying this DUI together." And he's like, No, I'm leaving." And he left. And I picked a jury. I did an opening. I put on the case, the state's case in chief. The officer, the deputy, was incredible. Like this guy was just like, his report was impeccable. His testimony was great. And, the judge, I think a few times was like, "This guy, like, this is the best the state's got." And, and we've got a guilty verdict. And I walked out of there, and I was like simultaneously like exhilarated and just terrified. And I was like, "What just happened?" And I went back to my desk, and I finished filling out my insurance forms, and I went home, and I thought, okay, well, there's that experience that you were looking for. And then, 2 years later, I had tried 100 cases,
Wow.
made some like horrifically boneheaded mistakes and lessons and learned lessons. And and then I turned that into an opportunity to go work for, the firm was acquired, but the name at the time was Freeborn and Peters, which was a renowned litigation firm in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I went there. I was one of 120 litigators, and I spent 11 years there as an associate and then a partner. And you think about boot camp, right? For like the Marines, it's intensive. It's like 8 weeks or whatever, or 6 weeks. I had an 11-year boot camp, and I can say without any hesitation that the lawyer that I am today, for better or worse, is a byproduct of the incredible lawyers I worked with at that firm. And just like, it's almost like a kid to the extent that your candy is learning how to be a good lawyer, like a kid in a candy store. There were the best brief writers, the best trial lawyers, the best deposition takers, the best people who were able to counsel their clients. And I just would like sit back and work with, 50 different lawyers and think like, I like how she does this, or he's great at that, or she's an amazing trial lawyer. And I just like learned, and I stole, right? I just was like, I'm going to absorb this. And I became, I think, an effective litigator because I tried to turn myself into like a Swiss Army knife of skills. But I mean, that my road to my success was paved with like the work and the experience and the successes of like so many other lawyers. I mean, I could spend an hour naming them and talking about them. It's incredible. You don't realize that when you're a young lawyer. You're like, oh, I just need to go do it. And then you're like, no, you need to like learn from people, right? That's the best way. And then obviously learn enough to then you can go do it, and then you make mistakes, and then you evolve and you mature. So
it is a practice, I think.
100%.
People, and I think folks, even in other professions that aren't so clearly defined as a practice, like being a doctor or being a lawyer, yes. I think that it's good for, even folks like me to sit back and remember that sometimes we should approach our careers and our professions like that too. We should try to learn from others, learn by osmosis, recognize that experience may teach us lessons that we're not going to be able to pick up in a book.
I mean, and again, that's another episode of podcast altogether.
Yeah.
The way I was taught to be a lawyer did not prepare me to be a lawyer. Law school was a great experience. It rewired my brain. Some of that overthinking I mentioned earlier is a direct product of those 3 years that I spent in law school. But you realize like why when Abraham Lincoln was a lawyer, that most lawyers didn't go to law school. They had apprenticeships, right? They went and they did it. And, it's funny that you say it's a practice. I had one judge specifically that I appeared in front of many, many times as a criminal prosecutor. And I would make, again, boneheaded mistakes. And he would say, Mr. Campobasso, that's why they call it the practice of law. Like, because I would just be like, Your Honor, I'm embarrassed. And he's like, he was incredibly gracious about it. And, he did his job. But at the end of the day, he just was like, look, I see, this young lawyer who cares. He works hard. Like, he's showing up. He makes mistakes. And he was funny. His name was Charles Weech. He's now retired, but he was a former public defender, former public defender. And so you would imagine, and he was incredibly impartial, but you would imagine, as someone who is responsible for defending people who couldn't afford their own counsel, he had a lens of, hey, the burden of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt is like, and it's already the highest burden under the law. But then you get a former public defender who's hearing your case, and you had to be perfect. And he and I don't want to say we butt heads, because again, he was the judge. I was in his courtroom. I'm an officer of the court. I was always trying to be very respectful. But I'll never forget, after my year and a half, almost 2 years in the office, I went to his chambers. I no longer appeared in front of him at that time, but I went to his chambers to let him know I was leaving. And he said, this was in February of 2008. And he said, Mr. Campobasso, I know we did not always see eye to eye. He's like, but it is my sincere hope that 15 years from now, you're going to look back and you're going to say, you know what? I'm a better lawyer because I appeared in front of Judge Weech. And obviously here we are 16 years later, and I'm saying exactly that. And, you just don't realize, I think this isn't obviously specific to the law. This is specific to life. You don't realize, like, there's a very famous quote, and I'm not even going to try to say it because I don't remember the exact words, but the sentiment is like, your friends aren't like, they don't make you better. Your friends like accept you for who you are. It's actually your enemies that make you better, right? Because they challenge you and they look for your weaknesses. And if you're paying attention, they give you an opportunity to be stronger, to be better, to be faster. And so I don't think Judge Weech was my enemy by any means. He was doing his job, but he was incredibly difficult to practice in front of. But again, I am a person who believes that you make a mistake once, and you learn from it. If you make it more than once, that's a behavior, and that's not good. And so with him, I made a mistake. He would absolutely let me hear about it. It would be sometimes embarrassing. I would go back to my office and think, never again. And so absolutely, it's a practice. I practice today. I will practice until I stop practicing. I learn constantly. And that's one of the things that I love about my job, is that the law is ever changing. And because so much of the law is analyzing and applying the law to facts, right? Every time you encounter a set of facts, they're different. And so even on days where I'm dealing with similar issues, I find myself finding new ways to look at those issues, and hopefully new and exciting and effective ways to solve for them.
Talk to us a little bit about your path to GC, into tech, and to the GC role, both sort of before Enfusion and afterwards. And then I really want to dig in on this transition from DGC to GC, because I think that's one of the most interesting moments in your career.
Yeah, it definitely, I'm happy to expand on my particular journey there. I mean, I mentioned I had my 11 years in my law firm experience, and I loved it. And I kind of got to that, what I would say, like, I don't know if it was the top of the mountain, but near the top as a partner. And I was like, I think I want to go be an in-house lawyer. And people were like, what? Like, you just made partner. And I was like, yeah, I know. But also I feel like there's something else out there that I could be even better at. And right. And if you're not growing, I feel like you're dying. And so I just was like, look, it's a challenge. I'm not trying to be reckless. I just think this is something that I want to explore. And so I think I just turned 40. I went to a company called Elevate as a kind of an outside sourced, almost like a incremental AGC. And it allowed me to kind of straddle that line between law firm and also learning about what an in-house lawyer did. And to me, that was kind of a way to hedge. I was like, okay, well, if I don't love it, I'll just jump into the law firm thing again and I'll be fine. I loved it. And I did that for about a year and a half. And I was like, okay, this is for me. That's when I synced up with Truqua, and they were a small consultancy that was later acquired by IBM. I was their GC for like 6 months. I thought I was going to be there forever. COVID hit, and the owners of the business were like, we're a little worried about our revenue. They were a thriving business, and they continue to be. I've stayed very close with a lot of people there. But I was like, you know what? I don't want to, no offense to IBM. I didn't want to go necessarily be like a rank and file IBM lawyer.
Mhm.
I asked if they needed a GC. They did not. They already had one.
Yeah.
And then I was like, all right, well, I'm going to take some experience. I'm going to try to like, parlay that into something. And yeah, I like found out about Enfusion. It's coming up on 4 years for me there. When I joined, we were a private company. I was brought in as the DGC. I was the third lawyer. And yeah, I mean, the first year was getting ready for an IPO
Mhm.
and essentially institutionalizing legal ops. The two lawyers that I joined,
Uh-huh.
really smart people. Obviously, there's only so many hours in the day, only so much bandwidth. I came in and I was kind of given like carte blanche to just like start building process in all the parts of our business that we didn't have legal really involved.
Mhm.
And it was really exciting. I mean, it was also terrifying because I thought, oh, building something sounds fun. And then I thought, wait, I've never built this kind of a thing before. Like, and so, you pull on, you're like, hey, what have I seen work well? Not from a legal ops for a fintech company, but more like
Mhm.
how do good teams work, right? How do you leverage experience? What are the concepts that I think need to kind of permeate the overall presence and reputation of legal within our business? And with the support of our then GC and our AGC, we started to really stake out our role within the business and to educate people like, hey, lawyers aren't just people who draft contracts or say, no, we can't do that. Don't be
Right.
stupid. Sometimes we say that, sometimes we do. But there's a tremendous amount of versatility that a good business person who also is a lawyer can bring to a company. And, we've grown from, and I'll get to the transition in a moment, but we've grown from
Yeah.
3 lawyers when I joined to 8 lawyers now. And, we've got, swim lanes, as I call them, like functions. We have people
Mhm.
who are responsible. We have subject matter experts. In 2022, in the summer of 2022, I started talking with the then general counsel and others about like my career path.
Uh-huh.
That coincided with the general counsel, and I had worked, our general counsel at the time, he was very focused. We had just gone public. He was very focused on our board, supporting our
Mhm.
CEO. And really that's it. I mean, it was just like, hey, we're a new public company and no one here has ever done this from a legal perspective. And so he was
Yeah.
like uniformly putting all of his energy in that particular part of our business. Everything else fell to me. So
Uh-huh.
he used to joke, he's like, we're kind of like code general counsels. Like I do the public company stuff, you do everything
Mhm.
else. So when the time came and he decided, he had been there, he was homegrown, he'd been there for like 7.5 years, almost 8 years. He had decided to take a step back and maybe just like spend some time thinking about what he wanted next. And, he and our then CEO came to me and said, look, we would really like you to be his successor. And
Mhm.
I'll never forget, our then CEO said, can you do this job? And,
Right.
I was like, of course I can. Like, what a silly question. And in my head, I was like, can I do this job?
Right.
Um, and and I just was like, look, I'm either going to be wildly successful or I'm going to be a hilarious story for someone to tell someday. And, the jury's out on what the conclusion to that story will be. But, thus far, almost 2 years in, it's been an incredible ride. And
Mhm.
what I will say is, given the way that our team evolved, I had the incredible opportunity, like I said, to oversee 80 to 90% of our day to day while our
Mhm.
former GC was focused on the public company stuff. So when the time came and he stepped away, all I really had to do was to learn that. And I was able to backfill some
Mhm.
roles, hand things off to people on my team who I trust, who I continue to trust and rely upon. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to spend a year learning what it means to be a public company general counsel, because I've now been a general
Yeah.
counsel at a private company. I've been a DGC at a public company. And yeah, I mean, I read books, I went to seminars, I called friends, I called outside counsel, and I was like, hey, is this right? Is this wrong? And, thankfully, because as you would imagine at that level, at this level, the margin for error is much smaller than like a guy
Sure.
who's in a prosecutor's office trying to get somebody convicted of stealing a TV from Best Buy, right? Like the stakes are different. And so I, thankfully, given the laundry list of people that I've learned from in my career and the people who have advocated for me and taken time to like teach me, I've had, I think, a pretty successful 2 years in this role almost. And
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'll talk to people and they'll say, your career is so unique. Like prosecutor,
Totally.
litigator to public company general counsel. Like, I don't know that I've ever heard that journey before. And yeah, I wish I could say that this was by design. It definitely was not. I mean, I've made incremental decisions along the way, and I've always opted to bet on myself and to say, hey, look, no one's going to outwork me. There's definitely going to be somebody out there
Yeah.
smarter than me, but like, I'm going to leave it all on the field. Right. And I've done that. And again, I make mistakes. Thankfully these days they're very small and easily reparable, but yeah, it's been an incredible ride. And obviously I'm hopefully, just in the middle of it, getting started. I don't know if getting
Yeah.
started is the right way. I don't want to work till I'm 90, but yeah, it's been a really cool experience. And there's times where I'll kind of pick up my head and look around and think like, oh, I'm actually doing it. Like, I'm doing the job. Right. And it's not that I'm like, I didn't think I was capable, but I just didn't know. And yeah, every day is interesting and unique, but there's an incredible team at Enfusion, both my legal team and our executive team, and everybody from the top down. Our board is wonderful. And, they have faith in me. They trust me. They look to me to be somebody who's practical, and I really enjoy it. And it's an incredibly fulfilling way to spend, 60 hours a week. So,
part of that transition is picking up the public company stuff and building the relationships with board members. And I want to hear a little bit about that. But I'm also curious about, you're almost like a peer of sorts to the rest of the legal team. And now you become the GC and everyone's boss. And like, how do you manage that transition? And how do you, I'm sure the outgoing GC did a lot of things really well. There are probably other things that you want to do slightly differently, right?
Yes.
Or new initiatives that you feel like weren't prioritized before that now you do want to prioritize. How do you make that transition well with the team, and how do you own the role with them? That's something that I'm really curious about.
Yeah, Tyler, I've never thought about that. I mean, I thought about building a team and like having a team function well, but I've never thought about like, hey, how did they view, it was happening to me, right? So I wasn't like,
right.
And I try to be a very empathetic person and put myself in other people's shoes, but I will say I think I was so hyper focused on like not dropping the ball in my new role that I was like, hey guys, like I'm going to be over here, join me, jump in the water is fine. And I like to think that the success that I've had, we've hired as we've gone, but like we have not had anybody on my team since I took over leave, like resign.
That's amazing.
Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the continuity of that is
wow.
incredible. Yeah. The continuity is incredible. I don't take credit for that. I try to lead and build a culture of like, look, guys, like guys, girls, men, women, like I am someone who will do anything that I ask you to do. And odds are like, if you're busy and I can just do it without you even knowing about it, I'll do it. Like many of our templates and our forms that we now use for various parts of our business, I created, like I drafted, and I will have people come to me and be like, hey, when you created this, and sometimes they'll be like, look, I think we should do this differently. And I'm like, have at it, like own it. Like I trust you. You're here for a reason. And I try to lead through like empowerment and giving my team agency and saying, look, and I've said this on many occasions, and not just because it sounds cool to say, but it's like, look, if there's credit, it's yours. If there's blame, it's mine. And, presuming that if they've got something from start to finish, they know what they're doing. If at some point in time they bump into something that's unsure, bring it to me. If I co-sign on something or I'm like, hey, let's do it, I'm comfortable with that risk. If there's an issue at some point and the CEO's like, what happened here? That's me. And I tell them like, look, there's a saying, heavy is the head that wears the crown. It is absolutely like it captures. But the great thing is, I find myself on a consistent basis, like just reacting, have you ever read the book Blink about just making like snap decisions? Like there's also another book called, Think Fast, Think Slow, I think is what it's called. And, or maybe some version of that, but it's about making decisions from a place of like confidence, but also your gut, which, from everything I've ever read, your gut is the combined, central processing of every experience you've ever had and every lessons you've learned. And so I find myself, as DGC, for example, to kind of juxtapose the two, maybe I was making 25 to 30 decisions a day. I probably make 100 a day now. And
Right.
I don't allow myself to kind of get paralyzed by the analysis of things. But a huge part of that is I'm incredibly lucky. My team, I have 3 direct reports, and even the people that are not my direct reports, I just came off of a call with one of them right before this. And I had forwarded her an email yesterday, and I was like, hey, I don't even have a minute to look at this. I will. Could you take some time and read through it, and let's meet tomorrow? And we got on this call, Tyler, and she was like, I've read it. I pulled the supplemental materials. I've analyzed the issue. There's 2 questions. Here's what I think we should do on both. I asked her a couple questions, and I said, I agree with you. Let's do that on both. And I just was like, unbelievable. From a user experience for me.
Yeah.
And that's one of the more junior lawyers on my team. And,
right.
It's incredible that I have the opportunity to continue to learn from people that have been practicing for 3 years, right? They just have different experiences. They came from different places. And I think that's a huge value add for anyone who's a lawyer or any profession. Keep learning, right? Keep being open to the fact that you don't know everything. And you wouldn't know it from how much I've been talking on this podcast, but I'm a big believer in if you're talking, you're not learning, right? And that's, there's a lot to learn. Everybody you encounter has something to teach you, good or bad.
The Abstract is brought to you by SpotDraft, an end-to-end contract lifecycle management system that helps high-performing legal teams become 10 times more efficient. If you spend hours every week drafting and reviewing contracts, worrying about being blindsided by renewals, or if you just want to streamline your contracting processes, SpotDraft is the right solution for you. From creating and managing templates and workflows, to tracking approvals, e-signing, and reporting via an AI-powered repository, SpotDraft helps you in every stage of your contracting. And because it should work where you work, it integrates with all the tools your business already uses. SpotDraft is the key that unlocks the potential of your legal team. Make your contracting easier today at SpotDraft.com. Maybe it's just the way that you do the job and the way that you manage and other folks picking that up. I can totally see how you would be a great partner to the business, or how the CEO would say, I can go to Matt and he's going to sort of give me straight advice that is practical, that thinks about risk, but doesn't just think about risk, that also thinks about the business. Are there ways that you build that mindset or build that as a culture within your legal team, ways that you sort of help set that tone so that way all those other folks on your team are out there talking to the business in the same way that you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of it is, I think, hopefully some of it is leading or demonstrating that through my own behaviors. Part of it is we're very rigorous in how we hire. And so, I don't look for a valedictorian or an Ivy League graduate. I look for somebody who has practical real world experience. And look, I'm a guy who couldn't get OCIs in law school. And I went through a prosecutor's office and I made $40,000 a year for a couple of years, trying to pay law school debt. I don't view there to be one path to being an effective lawyer. And I definitely don't view that as the case when you're thinking about being a business person who is also a lawyer as an in-house counsel. So we've been very fortunate to hire people who I think have a similar mentality to the one that I possess, which is our job here is to facilitate the business and allow it to execute its strategy and to operate. So I tell my team, start from yes and then work backwards. Don't start from no and have them convince us that we can do this in a way that, because no is where lawyers, I think, tend to want to start from, because it's I don't know anything about this. So until I understand it and I'm comfortable, I can't say yes.
Right.
I always say conceptually, meet them at yes. And then more often than not, where we get, Tyler, is yes, let's do that. But instead of A, B, C, D, let's do A, D, G, Y, right?
Totally.
Same outcome. We're sidestepping some legal, let's call them landmines. And I always tell my team, people, we're lawyers. A lot of us have, God complexes as far as hey, you don't understand. I went to law school. And I joke, but I mean, lawyers tend to have egos, right? And they think oh, let me tell you how the world works. And it's look, the business, they know things about things that I'm never going to understand. And so I tell my team, lead with like why. I think it's Simon Sinek book, Start with Why.
Yeah.
Like, go into every situation open to learning something from the other person, not just trying to be like King Solomon who says like, here's your solution, split the baby, right? Like that doesn't help. And it's not like the legal advice is not one size fits all. It's very fact intensive. The other thing to your question about, facilitating and acting as a business partner rather than a lawyer or like a brick wall is I always tell my team, I was actually just on with our COO earlier today, and I was talking with him about this. This is advice I've given my team. This is actually advice that I gave my 14-year-old son recently. I said, everything that we do as humans, as lawyers, as business people, every situation we encounter, we have three choices, right? Mm-hmm. One is make the situation better, like help solve it. Mm-hmm. One is walk through it without any impact, neutrally. Or the third is leave it worse off than we found it. And I've told my son, I've told my team, I've told my colleagues, we should never leave something worse off than we found it, ever. And if we walk through something and we look back and we realize we did, double back and clean it up. At a minimum, let's be neutral, right? There are going to be situations where somebody comes to us from the business and they just don't know what they've got. And they're like, I wanted to talk to legal because this is written on paper and paper's contracts. And I'm like, look, this is not for legal. Like, go talk to that person. And sometimes that's the case, right? But my default, and I tell my team their default, and I've told my kids their default should be add value. And when you think about the value of why we're here, we're not here to say no. We're not here to eradicate every risk that a business might bump into. We are here to facilitate the execution of our strategy. We're here to help the company return value to our shareholders. And we're here to make sure that when people are making business decisions, like our CEO, other executives, that they are fully apprised of risks and they have a sense of, hey, not only am I going to give you a roadmap here on how to do this the right way, I'm going to actually co-pilot with you and we're going to do this together. And I'm going to own this through the end, not because I don't trust you, not because I don't think you're capable of handling it, but because I care and my commitment is to our business. So I think it's, I'm a big acts of service person. I think that's I think that's my love language. Someone told me once. And I think that actually suits in-house lawyers' roles well. How do you serve the person that's coming to you? No one ever comes to a lawyer and says, hey, no problems here. Everything's great. Just wanted to tell you, have a good day. No one comes to me and says that. People come to me and they say, my world's on fire, or, hey, everything burned to the ground. Mm-hmm. What do we do? Or I want to do this thing and I don't want to start a fire. And it's funny. I think I was a third-year associate and I was telling a colleague of mine, I'm like, why does everyone who calls me have a problem? He's like, are you serious? And I was like, yeah. Like I was like legitimately like exasperated. And he was like, you're a lawyer, man. Like that's what people go to lawyers for. People don't come to lawyers for like high fives, right? They come to lawyers because they're like, hey, I got a problem. Either I might have a problem and I want to avoid it, or I do have a problem and I need you to help me solve it. So that has been, what I've preached probably too verbosely to my team, but I'm just like, look, let's add value. Let's find ways to lift up our business partners. Let's protect the company. And if we have to say no 1 out of every 20 times, say no. And what I have found, Tyler, and this is an incredible, like you have a concept and you're like, I think if we can get to this point, then if I have to say no, people will be like, yeah. And what I've had people say to me, to my team is, you know what? You guys never say no. The fact that you're saying no right now, this conversation can be done. Like, I get it. Like if you're telling me no, like you will turn over every rock to find a way to help me do what I need to do. If you're saying there's no way, there's no way. And that has manifested itself time and time again in my life and my career here at Enfusion. And it's great to have that sort of trust and ability to collaborate with people and that they'll defer to you and not just say, oh, well, you're being too conservative because you're a lawyer. And like I tell people, I'm a business person who has a law degree. I'm responsible for legal risk, but I'm not special, right? Somebody here who's an accountant doesn't just sit there with an abacus all day. They have to think about how those numbers influence the business, right? Money in, money out. And so I think that anybody who's thinking about the transition to being an in-house lawyer, if you feel like you would like to stretch some of those muscles and not be purely kind of more academic. And not that all law firm
Mm-hmm.
lawyers are academics, but you go to a law firm to be a specialist, right? Oh, we're going to charge you $1,000 for this person's time because there's 10 people in the country that know this much about this area of law.
Yep.
You go into a lane, and look, people have had incredibly brilliant storied careers doing that. It wasn't for me. I was like, look, I need a little more variety. I want to really continue to evolve. And yeah, the move in-house has absolutely helped me realize that.
I think one of the things you're sort of talking about is having an owner's mindset. Like, I am a part of this. Isn't my client who I'm advising, and if they walk away and they don't take my advice, like, who really cares,
Yeah.
right?
I'm going to invoice them, and they'll pay me, and whatever.
I am curious. I try to ask this to a few different people. Like, how do you hire for that? How do you actually uncover someone who you think is going to be an owner, or someone who you think is going to be practical as a part of the hiring process? You seem like a very thoughtful guy. I'm sure you've thought about, like, how do we actually evaluate candidates as they're coming into the pool for these roles?
Yeah, I think, one of the gating questions we asked, Tyler, is just like, why do you, if you've never been an in-house lawyer before, which we have a lot of people on my team who came from law firms,
Mm-hmm.
I say, why do you want to be an in-house lawyer, right? And I've heard, shockingly, the hours are less, more work-life balance, like blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, number one, that's false advertising. Like, you're not keeping your time in like 6-minute increments, but like
Right.
you have busy weeks, and there are times where this job is as demanding as any job I've ever had.
Uh-huh.
So, why do you want to do this, right? Like, what is it about working at this company in this sort of a role? And then I do a lot of questions, and I think probably different leaders on my team have different, ways that they approach it. But we've talked about this. Like, we want people who want to like think beyond, oh, well, I feel like and I've heard people say this at a law firm, everything is very reactive. You're a hired gun.
Hmm.
Like, you, to your point, you give advice, hang up the phone. You're like, I don't know. Phone rings again. It's a different client. Whatever happened with that thing? I don't know. There's no accountability. I mean, you can lose a client if you're not giving them good advice. But like, when I was a law firm lawyer, I would work on 50 different clients matters a year, and I cared about each of them. I didn't really know any of them. And so when people come to me and they're like, hey, I really want to know this business, and I want to get to know this client like inside and out, and I want to understand. So, again, the best lawyers that I know are able to, on an active, ongoing basis, absorb information and pivot their thinking efficiently and fluidly. And, we do a lot of, I do things. I'll say like, hey, if you got this, we actually have a question, like almost like a hypothetical that we give. And it's when somebody gets past a certain level of screening, it'll say, hey, you are at lunch with your new head of HR. And in that conversation, she says the following. And then it's like, spend no more than 30 minutes and give me an itemized list of every issue that you feel like you have to leave this lunch and go look into. And
interesting.
Yeah. And you'll get like novels, like law school exams. You'll get like just buzzwords and each one's different. And it's funny. I took that was part of my interview process, and I did it. And the GC, my predecessor, called me. The talent acquisition person called me and was like, hey, our general counsel would like to talk to you. And we got on the phone and he said, can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah, of course. And he said, how long did you spend on that? And I said, 6 minutes. And he basically, I mean, it didn't go quite like this, but if it was like a movie, it would have been like, his next question was like, when can you start? And I think he was thinking, look, you are in a pressure cooker, right? And not to add a analysis or a critique of law firms, but if there's 10 hours of work that you can justify, you're going to do 10 hours of work, right?
Right.
It's directly tied to your revenue. And there are ethical boundaries, and I know lawyers are very good about that. In my experience, I'm sure there are people who push the line. I do not want to stretch anything out beyond one more second than I need to, because I have 20 other things right behind it. And so decisiveness and ability to make snap decisions once you know that you've given something the due amount of attention. And so this example that we use, to me, is, and I understand why my predecessor was like, how long did you spend on this? And I think he, and we never talked about it, but I think his thought was, this is impressive, assuming he didn't spend 3 hours on it. Right. And I was like, yeah, 7 minutes. And he's like, really? And I said, yeah, why would I lie about that? Like, that's not, hopefully it doesn't look like I did it in 7 minutes, because that means that but he's like, no, he's like, look, you grabbed every meaningful issue, and you did it in a way that's reflective of the pace of what we do here.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you got to be smart enough and aware enough to issue spot, but you also have to be like thoughtful enough not to overspend resources, because it's just not a luxury you have. So it's a blend of a lot of things. I know I've given you kind of a few different pieces to that puzzle,
Yeah.
and it's an art, right? It's not a science. And again, I'm sure at some point we're going to make a wrong hire and it'll come back and it'll haunt me, but we've been incredibly lucky so far. And we tend to have every candidate, we have a small team. We have every candidate meet every person on the team, either for a substantive conversation, or we'll do like a 3-on-1, like just get to know people.
In person.
Sometimes in person, sometimes in Zoom. It depends.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we have conversations, and I'm just like, hey, like, tell me about how you spend your time. And at the end of the day, like, we're all human beings, and I don't want a robot, right? Like, AI is coming.
Yeah.
I'll see AI when it gets here. Like, I want somebody who's going to be thoughtful and human. And yeah, like I've said many times, like, leading this team has been the honor of my career. Like, they're some of the smartest, kindest, hardest working people I've ever met. And I'm lucky to call them my colleagues. And like I said, I could give you 10 examples of things I've learned from people on my team today. And these are people that report to me, right? You think of like a boss, it's like, well, you should know everything. I don't know everything. I know that I don't know everything. But yeah, I think, trying to lead that way, trying to empower people to be thoughtful and help people not be scared of the consequences should they try to reach for something as a business person, which isn't a natural muscle for a lawyer. And then knowing, hey, if you fall down, I'm going to pick you up. And if there's consequence, I will be standing in front of you. Right. Like, and I think it gives people a confidence that they can get out there and really try. So
this has been a great conversation, Matt. I've got a few fun questions for you that I like to ask all of our guests as we start to wrap up.
Sure.
The first one is, and what's your favorite part of your day to day? I mean, you probably have a lot because we've had such a great conversation.
Yeah, I love the people.
Yeah.
At a law firm, you got a ton of smart people, but they're all kind of versions of each other unless you kind of dig down and get to know people at a human level. Here, it's like you've got like technologists, and you've got people who, are HR professionals, and you've got finance people. And it's like the diversity of backgrounds and like the lenses through which they see the world. Like, I will be on call sometimes, and I'm just like sitting there listening, and I'm thinking like, this is fascinating to me. This is not at all, and less so now that I've been in this role for a couple of years, but like I can remember early on, and just really smart people and people who want to do good work, who are passionate and care about the outcomes of things. And yeah, I mean, just honestly, nice people, like just not even nice. Nice is something you can pretend to be. Kind people who are kind, and people who like actually give a damn about like what their work says about who they are, and they take pride in those things. Collaborative. There's not a ton of ego. There's a lot of like, let's just get to the best outcome. And yeah, I mean, I joke. I mean, we've been laughing here a little bit. I joke with my team constantly. Like, we have we use Slack, and so we have a Slack channel, all 8 of us, and it is nonsensical. Like the things that we joke about on there. I mean, it's all it's business. I mean, it's all professional.
Yeah, workplace appropriate, but still fun.
Thank you. That's the words I was looking for. Workplace appropriate, but like just nonsense. And it allows us. Any given day, somebody will be like, "Hey, random question of the day," and then it's like, if you weren't a lawyer, what would you be? And then it just goes on these crazy tangents. Like, what was the worst job you've ever had? Don't say Enfusion, right? Like, we're just like, and it's great. And we all, it's Slack. It's sitting here on my monitor all day. A lot of days I don't look at it until like bedtime. And then I'm like, oh man, I missed some great stuff today, and, but I'm definitely the one to get in there and like heart something and, and be like, oh, this is great or hilarious. Or, my daughters, I have a first grader and a fifth grader. They had the first day of school today. I took pictures of them. I sent them to my parents. I put them on Slack, and everybody was like, here's my kids on their first days. And next thing I know, it was like 12 pictures. And I was like, you know what? At the end of the day, when we're all on our deathbed, or we're all, what do they say, shuffling off this mortal coil, like, it's not going to matter how many issues I solved at Enfusion. This is a means to an end. I care about it. I'm passionate about it. I take pride in what I do. But this is something to facilitate like living life. And, like I said earlier, I'm very lucky to be in the role that I'm in. But yeah, the people are just absolutely wonderful.
What was the worst job you had? That's a good question. I might have to work that into my podcast scripts from now on.
So, you know, it's a good, it is a good question. Growing up, my mom, who is one of the most amazing people in the world, she'll be listening to this, so that will mean a lot to her that I said that on the podcast.
That's cute.
She worked at a hotel growing up. She was like the front desk manager.
Uh-huh.
Bookings, incoming, outcoming. She's an incredibly personable. I get a lot of my energy and zest for life from her. And I had a job for a couple of years, not at a hotel, and I had come home from college, and she's like, "Hey, instead of going back to this other job, which you've done for a couple of years now, like come work at the hotel." And I was like, "What would I do?" And I was 19, 20 maybe,
Uh-huh.
at a car. She's like, "Well, there's like a facilities manager." And I was like, "Manager sounds cool." Like I didn't know what that meant. I was like, "Cool." So I showed up day one. It was like beginning of June. It was Chicago summer, but for some reason it was like the dog days in June, and it was like 90 degrees, and it was an older hotel, so the air conditioning wasn't great. I walked in, I was immediately sweating, and I was like, "Hey, mom," and she's like, "Hey, go find so and so. He'll be your like collaborator here." And I went and I found out the facilities manager means janitor. And no offense to janitors. Like everybody has to earn a living. My dad started out his career at a company he ran for many years as the janitor. And so,
Wow.
yeah. And so I did it for like an hour, and I went to the front desk and I was like, "Mom, like, I don't love this." And she's like, "Why?" And I was like, I'm not a mechanical person. They want me to like sweep for the pool and fix a faucet. And I'm like, "I don't know how to do this." And she's like, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to quit." And she was like, "Really?" And I was like, "Yes." And I quit. And I quit like 2 hours after I started. And so that's an unfair to say it's the worst job I've ever had, because I really didn't do it.
You
for
didn't
all
have
that
the
long.
job for very long.
Correct. But I actually think that what I did was noble, because I think we all need to be very honest with ourselves about our shortcomings. And they were never going to get the ROI from me that they deserved. And so I did everyone a favor, and I went home and I slept the rest of the day. And then I went back to my old job and I worked there all summer. So I worked 2 hours as a facilities manager at a Courtyard by Marriott in Wooddale, Illinois, back in 1997. So
Slightly different type of management.
Very different.
You're currently in.
Absolutely.
I'm always looking for good books to read. Do you have a book recommendation you want to share with the audience?
So yeah, I mean, I've got two. I usually have one or two books on my desk at all times. One is a book that my brother, who is a lawyer, he actually is a lawyer at IBM. I'm going to hold them up here in case people need to see what they look like and they want to buy them. One is called The Psychology of Money. I think it's a pretty well-known book, and it's about how people think, wealth, greed, happiness are scientific things. A lot of how you manage money, investing, how you run a budget, how you invest, all those things is more emotional than it is like non-emotional, I guess, or practical. So I'm reading that. It's great. And then the other is a book that I'm reading for, I think, the third time. And my mom, the aforementioned front desk manager at the Courtyard by Marriott, gave me this book a few years ago. It's called The Mount of Olives. And it's the subtitle is 11 Declarations to an Extraordinary Life. And it's definitely the furthest thing from like a self-improvement book or anything like that. But the thread of the book, and I'll keep it very short, is takes place hundreds of years ago. There is a young man who is a soldier in the Roman army, and he's deaf. I've read it multiple times, and I just actually picked it up again yesterday. And he's in an orphanage, and he gets older and he leaves. But as he's leaving, this young girl tells him, she treats him very kindly, and basically he plants all these olive seeds before he leaves on the hills of Rome. And this book takes him on this journey around Europe, and he kind of learns about life and how to treat people when he meets fishermen and people like that and mothers and things. And he comes back, I think 10 years later, and he's like a different man. And you find out, and I didn't know this, but apparently when you plant an olive tree, it takes anywhere from like 6 to 10 years to bear fruit. And so the whole idea of the book is like, do the things now to give yourself a fuller more like robust future. And yeah, I've read it now. This is the third time. It's an incredibly, I'm not an overly spiritual person. I'm not, I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic schools. I don't attend mass regularly, to the extent your listeners were curious, but I'm a pretty faith-based guy. And I always feel like, there are tried and true ways to live life. And this book is a good reminder. It kind of anchors me a little bit. And so, yeah, anytime I'm feeling like whimsical or reflective, I always grab this book. And again, my mom is listening. She's going to be like, I gave him that book. So thank you, Mom.
Perfect to pick it up right before a podcast like this.
Exactly.
Speaking of reflective, my last question that I like to ask all of our guests, and that's if you could look back on your days being a young lawyer, maybe just getting started as a prosecutor or just graduating law school, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I would say is it's okay to doubt yourself. Like, I feel like, lawyers are oftentimes like perfectionists. I am absolutely someone like that. It has taken me, 18 years now practicing to start to be able to show myself like grace. And, when you're young and you doubt yourself because you don't know how to do something or you've never encountered it, you start, if you don't harness that energy the right way, the self-talk becomes, you're a fraud, you're an imposter. I remember my first 2 years at Freeborn and Peters, I was like, they're going to fire me today, like every day. And then I would get my review and they would be like, you are our top second-year associate. And I would think, like, are you guys, like, you guys are messing with me, right? Like eventually you start to be like, oh, I'm learning. Everybody's figuring it out, right? We go back to your comment about the practice of law. And I think when you doubt yourself when you're young, you push it down. At least I did. And you don't allow yourself to just like kind of live in that. And so I think my advice to myself when I was a prosecutor, when I was a young litigator, don't be afraid to doubt yourself. Like, explore where that doubt comes from and then make a conscious choice to like lean into that and attack the things that cause that doubt, right? Whether it's a lack of experience or a lack of like not value, self-worth, any number. A doubt comes from so many different places, right? And I know every single human being has doubts in some shape or form. But yeah, I think people view doubt as a negative thing, and it is, I think, conceptually is not great, but like it's not going anywhere. It's like fear, right? Like you're always going to be scared of something. But you can choose, like, do I ignore it or do I like double click and do I like dig into it and do I use that as a method or a tool to be better? And I think doubt for me, when I learned to have a healthier relationship with doubt, is when I feel like I started to really accelerate my growth as a lawyer and as a person. So
I love that answer. That's a great way to end this conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of The Abstract, Matt. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me, Tyler. Again, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time.